Hello and welcome to Writing the Rapids. I'm your host, Joe Bielecki. Here's how this show works. It's a writing, interview, conversation, podcast, and audio literary magazine where the writers who have been on the show tell me who should be on the show in the future. I collect all the names that my previous guests have given me, and I use that pool to pick from when choosing who's going to be on the next month. This month on the show we had Brendan Vidito. He's a writer from Sudbury, Ontario. His work has appeared in several magazines and anthologies, including Deadbait 4, Splatterpunk's Not Dead, Strange Behaviors, an anthology of absolute luridity, and Tragedy Queens, stories inspired by Lana Del Rey and Sylvia Plath. You can visit him online at brendanvidito.com, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook at Brendan Vidito. Links in the show notes. Similarly, there's links in the show notes to my Patreon, patreon.com/WTR. If you want to help support the show, patreon.com/WTR. The podcast is free for a reason, but if you want to help me buy the books of the people on the show and maybe pay them in the future, maybe have shows more frequently than once a month, patreon.com/WTR. But enough of me shilling. Let's get into this wonderful conversation that I had with Brendan. One of the things I noticed while I was researching your writing was that you have a lot of writing published, but it all seems to be mostly in print, which seems notable.
Yeah, I guess as opposed to things in an online publication, you mean, right?
Yeah, as opposed to me, who has like a dozen flash pieces published only online.
Yeah, I consider myself, I guess, really fortunate because I do like, the idea of having something published in a physical format. But I basically, like, for a while when I was submitting my stories, I would actively seek out. I'd be submitting to more anthologies and stuff, so they would, it would be like print on demand type things, and so I was actively seeking out physical format style books. That's not to say that like I feel like with a lot of online stuff there's a wider reach, but I guess in my case I just happen to be kind of luckier on the physical front.
I like that. I that's an interesting way of going about it, for sure. It's also just kind of nice because it forces the reader to engage with the other writers. Like, I can't, I had previously bought Tragedy Queens, which your piece Stag Loop is published, and I bought that to research Lisa for a previous episode, and in doing so, like, read the entire collection and was introduced to all these other writers.
Yeah, it's an excellent collection.
Yeah, for sure. Whereas I don't necessarily read every single piece in an edition of Oculum or something. I mean, sometimes I do, but not necessarily all the time.
Yeah, I have to agree. I find it's when you pick up a short story magazine, I find myself, you'll gravitate towards the writers or the pieces that seem most appealing to you. And I feel like it's easier sometimes to just be like, oh, I'll come back to this later. But with anthologies, it's, I remember Lisa would often use the kind of like the mixtape analogy.
Mm-hmm.
It really holds true because it's just, there's so much variety. You never really get bored, especially with Tragedy Queens. Like, there's such an array of topics and styles that, you're being pulled along, and by the time you reach the end, you're like, oh man, I actually, I read through this, and there's really no chance when an anthology is put together properly. There's no chance for the reader to get bored. So that's sort of the appeal for me when I'm submitting to books like that.
That's a strategy I haven't encountered before. And granted, this is episode 13, so I've only ever talked to 13 writers in my entire life. But that's a unique strategy, and I don't know. I like it. Your work primarily seems to fit in the body horror or splatterpunk or hardcore uh, subgenres. What draws you to writing that?
Um, well, my history with horror fiction is a little weird and complicated because growing up, I didn't really have much of a fascination for horror. It came sort of later in my mid to late teens. Prior to that, I was born in '91, so I'm very much like of that generation of like when the Harry Potter books came out and the Lord of the Rings films. So I was really big into fantasy. Uh, and then when I was 15 years old, I started like having experiencing these really bizarre symptoms, like these visual and auditory hallucinations that were really terrifying in nature. Like I would see like basically demonic entities and stuff. And so for a while, I was kind of carted around to different, psychologists and doctors and whatnot. And eventually they diagnosed me with central nervous system lupus. So that was really like kind of it forced me to reevaluate my life. And the whole experience was so frightening that I actively sought out a way to almost like immunize myself against that fear through this kind of bizarre uh, exposure therapy where I watch every horror movie and read every horror book I could find. And that kind of just started this obsession and my preoccupation with the body and the way that I write about body horror is very much drawing from my own anxieties and kind of my knowledge of having to deal with that through the experience of this illness. So I think that's kind of like the genesis really of why I write body horror. It's very personal and it's something that I can kind of get behind.
Sure, that's fascinating. Uh, I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, for those, I just actually wrote. Well, it was the first time ever I decided to write about it, and I believe it's coming out this month. It's a piece on how I got into horror, and it goes into detail about my experiences. And yeah, it was the reason I put it off so long because it was difficult to write. Having to kind of dig through all those negative emotions and relive those experiences. It definitely wasn't a fun experience, but uh, it's like hopefully like I'm not the only person that underwent this experience, and my hope is that someone else who maybe is experiencing something similar will be like, oh hey, like I'm not alone. So that's kind of the my hope with this piece.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing on your Twitter you are holding a Gary Busey book, and
No.
that has totally derailed me.
I don't know. Like Gary Busey is just like this personal, like long running joke for me. I just think he's like hilarious in a very awful way. I don't know. He's just sort of like that creepy, weird uncle to me. And like I just remember, you ever see the movie Ginger Dead Man?
No.
No, I think I forget who put it out. It's one of those really like ultra low budget films, and Gary Busey. It's basically a spin on the whole Chucky idea, where like a serial killer inhabits an inanimate object, but in this case, it's Gary Busey's the serial killer, and he possesses a gingerbread cookie or a gingerbread man that murders people.
Oh my god.
Yeah, and I just thought that the whole movie's just absurd, and yeah, just Gary Busey's not. He's just kind of a weirdo that kind
Yeah,
of running.
there was a Hunter S. Thompson documentary because I was also 18 once, and it started out with Gary Busey like really condescendingly kind of berating the documentarian about the camera angle
Oh
and
man.
like directing the shot for himself, like, no, you need to walk up to me and say, hey Gary, and I'm gonna turn around for my coffee and then we're gonna talk and you're gonna stand here. And I'm like, whoa man, just chill
This,
out.
this this rings a bell. I think I did. I saw that same documentary. Yeah, yeah. He's definitely a strange man.
um But getting back to your writing, as I was reading Nightmares in Ecstasy on Clash Books now, um, it the back talks about, for fans of Cronenberg, Junji Ito, and Clive Barker. Um, and I think that's really fitting, especially the Junji Ito. Like, there's a couple pieces in there. Let me look up the name because it's the one where the woman's vagina is like a spider worm thing that comes out of her.
Yeah, Fuck Shock.
Fuck Shock, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that was the first. That's the Earl. Well, not the first that I wrote in the collection, but the first story that got published. It was published in issue number 6, I think, of Splatterpunk zine, and I wrote that one. I moved into so I think I was about 23 years old at the time, and I was in university, and I moved into my first apartment alone, and I didn't have internet, so I was like, what am I going to do? So I just sat down and wrote this story, and it was a story. When I reached the end, I'm just like, I was reading it over, and I was like, what the hell's wrong with me? But the funny thing is, yeah, like Junji Ito, he didn't directly influence that one. There is some Japanese influence to that one. Notably, there's a movie called I'm gonna screw up it's something 964 Pinocchio, I think it's called, and it's a Japanese cyberpunk horror film, and there's no real like direct line between that film and that story, but I kind of drew atmospherically from that one. But Junji Ito, there's a story in Nightmares called The Black Waters of Babylon, and the whole way I formatted that, because I like the way Ito has this thing about almost, I think they call it the page turn. So like when you reach the bottom of it, like the last panel on a page, you'll see a character's reaction, and then you turn the page, and it's like this full page illustration of this like incredibly like horrifying or graphic thing. So I wanted to replicate that in that story, and it's basically that one shocking moment at the end of that the story Black Waters of Babylon, where I wanted it to feel like that page flip in an Ito comic.
I can see that for sure. And the giant sort of, now that I think about it, the whole thing kind of gives me the like the end of Uzumaki sort of feeling.
Yeah, that cosmic implication kind of thing.
That's another thing I got, as I got a lot of cosmic horror, or at least sort of Lovecraftian, in that here's like an everyday person who just happens to stumble into something that's way bigger than an everyday person should ever deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah. The sex toys one, which I think is just called Sex Toys, right?
Yeah.
Felt very weird fiction.
Oh yeah, the main, actually the influence for that one is really weird. It's the work of Richard Kern, he's this notable kind of avant-garde, transgressive, I guess, photographer, and he made these really bizarre like 8mm films that around the time of writing that story I'd watch a lot, and that's where the idea of these characters like trying to make this kind of oversexed weird film came out of. But like in terms of Lovecraft, like I did like grow like as a when I was first getting into horror, obviously like I would read a lot of his work and I liked a lot of his stories, but like as I got older, I don't really think he's a good writer, like, and that's taken into account like his blatant racism and whatnot.
Yeah.
But what I do like that, just that the cosmic element. And for the last story in Nightmares in Ecstasy, it's called A Feast of You, and that one was sort of a flip on that idea where the main character turns out to be one of these cosmic entities, but it's a cosmic horror story framed as a domestic drama. So that was like, I think that's the one that's most heavily indebted to kind of Lovecraft's cosmology as opposed to any of the others, at least in terms of direct influence.
That reminds me sort of more of like a Thomas Ligotti sort of thing. where
Yeah,
it's smaller weird fiction.
yeah, because Ligotti, it's very. He said something once that I feel like I've kind of appropriated in my own work. He was speaking about Poe, which is how Poe, his stories aren't exactly set in our world. They're their kind of own self-contained kind of dream realities. And at least a lot of the stories in my collection, I tried to kind of achieve that, where everything feels kind of slightly off. Like if it were a film, like the camera would be canted most of the time. They show like just the kind of that unstable
Yeah.
state of mind. Yeah,
Yeah.
and like does a really good job of just like he doesn't feel the need to explain anything. He just kind of lets the weird shit happen. And for me, in terms of horror, like the cardinal sin for me is when a filmmaker feels the need to explain the source of the horror as opposed to just, you know, letting it happen and having the characters react.
Yeah, I mean, the probably one of the better things that Lovecraft said was that fear is like primal, and the most primal fear or pure form of fear is fear of the unknown. And as soon as you start expositing too much, you kind of ruin that, and you ruin it just in it becomes super easy to poke holes in what is being exposited, right?
Yeah,
Like if in It Follows we were given any more information than we were given, that movie would make no sense.
exactly. And just to speak of a different movie where it sort of embodies this idea that I was talking about with Hereditary for me.
Oh yeah.
I enjoyed it. I think I would say like 80% of it, and then suddenly when it became a pagan horror film, it totally lost me because I feel like if it was more like everything else outside of the kind of the proposed like supernatural force was more horrifying than what was revealed at the end, at least personally. Um, so I felt if like the thing that was menacing the family was just totally left in the dark, and it's just this unknowable force. I feel like the impact would have been a lot stronger.
I think you're
And
right. I was into it the whole time because that's my aesthetic.
yeah,
But from a
yeah,
narrative perspective, absolutely. I can see where you're coming from.
yeah,
Because there's that
yeah,
point in the movie where, like, your soul just drops into your toes, and you're like, oh, God.
yeah.
This movie is
It,
not going to be fun.
yeah, there's the middle of the film has one of the most powerful scenes, and that's probably like thanks to Toni Collette's performance too. Uh, yeah, she's just a total powerhouse in that film, and yeah, and it's just I guess it was just for me it was just sort of frustrating where I was like, oh man, this is so great, and then we suddenly like it didn't feel scary anymore to me.
Mm.
Because I always like with my stories, I like the idea of like closing a book and like still feeling like, oh, it's not over. Like whatever was happening in the story is going to kind of follow me for a little while. And that's something I struggled with, like with longer fiction, is like, because as a writer, I feel like sometimes it's just you get that impulse to explain it. You feel the need to sort of give a little bit more context to what you're describing, and it's easier to do with the shorter work. But yeah, it's a little trickier, like in my experience, at least with something a little longer.
I think so. I think you're kind of right on the money there. I have a longer form thing that I finished right around the time I finished college, and there's a lot of that sort of explaining without explaining that I was trying to do, because at one point I just like made the characters die and then reincarnate, and I was like, okay, I have no rules for reincarnation. What am I going to do?
Oh
And
yeah,
it leads to like the most vague passage I think I've ever written. Um,
and sometimes that works. Like I mean, I if it's done well, I prefer that than the mechanics of, because that's another thing. Like growing up reading fantasy, I didn't really give much thought to it, but coming back to it as an adult, uh, just that how painstaking it is for some of these writers having to the world building and stuff, and the like the intricacies of like, a magic system where it's just, yeah, it's some mind-boggling, and it's not something I would ever attempt to try myself.
It does almost seem as though the world building is the fun part for some of these authors, and then writing a book is a way to justify spending all that time building a world like that.
Yeah, and I recently encountered a writer, blanking on his name. Hold on. M. John Harrison. He wrote this, well, a series of novels and short stories called Viraconium. And his whole thing, he was trying to write a fantasy story that wasn't tied down by the notion of world building or canon or anything like that.
Hmm.
So he just kind of like, it's very bizarre. It starts almost like a dying Earth story that's set like in the distant future. But yeah, just because he's unburdened by those conventions, he's just able to focus on the story itself and not, every like the minutia.
That's really cool. It goes to that's like the exact opposite reason of why I don't read hard science fiction, right?
Yeah.
It's that whole thing. um so what what is next for you? Because we have Nightmares in Ecstasy, which is lots of shorter pieces. Are you working on a novel? Do you have a novel coming?
Yeah, it's actually like it's pretty much done. I'm just being very like meticulously combing over it. It'll be coming out through Clash. There's nothing, no date's been announced yet, but it should be out by the end of the year. Um, and yeah, I'm not quite sure. It might be a novella, it might be a novel. It'll be a short novel if it is. It really depends how much I decide to trim it. Um, yeah, and I feel like people who picked up Nightmares in Ecstasy will be a little not confused, but they'll be a little surprised at the direction the book takes. It's a lot more accessible than these short stories, and it can be extreme at times, but it's not anywhere near some of these stories, and it's an idea that I had kind of floating around my mind for about a decade, and it was actually the first thing I attempted to write after I really got into horror, and I realized really early on as I was writing it that I wasn't ready, that the idea was just too big for me to actually fully kind of wrap my head around at that point. I was too young and inexperienced.
Oh, interesting.
And the trigger for me was because the whole book, without really giving much away, it's a horror novel that examines the culture of fear, basically, that we inhabit right now. Um, and at the time, like, because I remember once a group of friends were talking about the first event that made us aware of like the wider world. So my partner's much older than me, and her story was the Berlin Wall falling. That was the first time that she kind of her eyes opened, and for me it was 9/11.
Sure.
So that kind of that specter of that is just hanging over a large part of my early adolescence and going forward from there. So yeah, this novel just kind of attempts to sort of explore like the notion of like fear itself and how it affects people kind of in today's society. And it's also like it takes a lot of conventions from the drug novel and marries those two things together. Yeah, I'm being vague because I don't want to
Yeah.
say too much at this point, but yeah, I just feel like it's different, but like it has the same surreal elements, and there is some body horror as well, but it's also like I think readers of the collection will be a little hopefully in a good way when they read the book.
Well, I'm sold on it already.
Awesome.
um It's interesting. One of the things I wanted to make a jokey big deal about is how you're the first non-American person I've had on the show.
Oh,
So
really?
we're now international. Um,
Perfect.
but you and I are also very closely the same age. I was born in '92,
Oh, okay.
and um, so being a Canadian, how did 9/11 like sort of manifest for you over there? Because I
Um,
remember what it was like as an 8-year-old American.
yeah. Um, I could only really speak to my personal experience because I was only I think yeah 9 I guess. Um, I just remember I think school ended early that day. They let us go home, and my mom picked me up, and she explained in like I guess the simplest terms she could what happened. And I think it was just being a kid, and you're like, oh man, like is this gonna work its way up here? And it was every restaurant you go to, from what I recall, like the news would be on, and then so it'd be I'm pretty sure like the coverage was fairly extensive, and just like being a naive kid, basically, like that was that fear of like how bad is it, not fully understanding exactly like the gravity of the situation, and like that fear of it working its way up into Canada.
Yeah,
Because I have no recollection of like pre 9/11 because I didn't do much traveling prior to that, and I feel like that's one of the areas that's just like the most blatantly affected.
yeah, for sure. You're. I'm looking at a map right now. You are closer to where I live in Michigan than um, New York, the city.
Oh,
Um, so that's something I find interesting. But um, yeah, it's interesting because for me it didn't necessarily open my eyes to the larger world like that. But I guess it's because it felt like home, but also not like home at the same time.
yeah, it was still far enough to be, like fairly remote from your experience, I guess.
Yeah, I also remember my parents like turning the TV off every time I went into the room, and
Oh yeah.
us being sent home from school with a letter that I didn't read, and then sort of like learning about it all kind of after it happened rather than as it happened. Um, and then that whole experience being tainted because like as I was learning about it as a young teen, it's also when like right around the time that YouTube was becoming accessible for every person who had iMovie or whatever. So I was learning about it while simultaneously learning about the conspiracy theories around it.
Oh, that's actually really interesting. That whole idea, that blurring of fact and fiction really plays into like my book, and it's something that really is really fascinating to me. It's because it's just we live in a world that makes misinformation so easy. So it fear has become this tool, and it always has been, but it's just even more like grotesque now with the internet, where it's just people use fear as a way as simple as like selling someone something as a preventative, like oh I don't know, like you should buy this for your car because it'll save your life if you get in a car accident or something. It's all like it's just like the marketing of fear. And then there's the politics of fear. Like it's there's not an area of society that's untouched by its influence, and that's just something that I was really kind of fascinated with and wanted to explore.
Huh. Yeah, I see where you're coming from. I don't even know how I would touch that.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to read it just to see how somebody else would begin to deal with that. Especially
Yeah.
because it seems like you're dealing with it in a more general sense where I just my own political leanings or whatever, like whenever I think about fear in that sort of way, I'm immediately drawn to like how fascists use it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Totally.
And so like it's hard for me to think about fear on a mass form like that as just kind of like this abstract concept that's everywhere,
Yeah,
and rather seeing it as like a tool that a very specific set of people are using. But I also get it in like advertising and stuff like that too, like that
yeah,
the
yeah,
undercoating in your car and stuff like that.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, that was the challenge about writing this was that, I'm grappling with this idea that's just like totally unwieldy, and it was a matter of just kind of honing it in and just filtering it through like the lead character, because I remember I wrote a first draft and I handed it to Christoph over at Clash Books, and he read it, and we both agree that this needs to be in first person, and I think that's a large part of it. It makes the story more intimate, and it also like it kind of it's more of a subjective point of view to this thing that's almost too big for one person to fully, like one narrator to fully encapsulate.
I like that idea. I have noticed that in reading your work, you do tend to not stick with one um, narrative distance.
Yeah, I tried to experiment with like there's first person present in there with a story called Piss Slave.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I feel most comfortable in third person uh, past tense. Uh, and I think it just mostly it works for a lot of these stories because of that weird kind of detached, like dreamlike distance. Uh, but it didn't quite work for the book, at least not in that draft. Um, and it's just fun to learn because like there's a bit of a learning curve when you're jumping back and forth between different tenses and styles. But yeah, I feel like in hindsight, I'm gonna be looking back on Nightmares and feeling like it was very experimental for me, just this playground of trying to figure out uh, what style kind of was the most appropriate for my purposes.
I really liked the morphing between the characters in Piss Slave.
Oh yeah,
I
yeah.
thought that was really clever. It reminded me kind of, and it's probably because this is the only analog I have, but it kind of reminded me of American Psycho when uh whenever Patrick Bateman's character, it only happens like two or three times, maybe just two, whenever he's about to get caught or doing something really, really extreme, it slips into third person for a couple paragraphs.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Um, and
yeah,
and this isn't like that at all, but that's kind of
yeah.
like where my brain
He
went.
detaches himself. Yeah, almost.
But this is like the exact opposite, where the character is like slipping into it.
Yeah, there. I don't know. Like, I can't really explain other than what's on the page, what's going on there. But yeah, it was just meant to just feel very jarring because the whole like, thesis of that story is that the one thing that unites basically every human being is pain, because
Mm-hmm.
that's something we can agree on. So it's just that it was kind of this visual representation of, they're basically like they're sharing a communion through physical pain and suffering. That was the whole idea in that one.
Yeah. You also have a piece that's in second person too, the video game walkthrough.
Oh yeah, that it was the walkthrough. Yeah, Miranda.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even remember writing that one to be
No.
honest. It was a last minute addition to the collection, and I wasn't sure it was gonna fit because it was so left field. Um, but I mean, yeah, I get like it's just the idea of a very kind of almost creepy pasta-ish, where it's just
Mm-hmm.
like this game that doesn't exist, and yeah,
Yeah. So somebody played PT and said, okay, let's do this.
yeah, yeah. Oh man, PT. Yeah, I remember those were the days. Like in terms of I don't play as much games as I did years ago, but yeah, PT. I just remember that one really well. It's just as a interactive because I feel like what I admire most about any art form is like if it takes full advantage of its medium, and as like a horror experience, like a virtual horror experience, that game really kind of doubled down on that. And that's one of the reasons I really enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You like needed a headset to because you had to speak into the game to have certain things happen.
Yeah, it was just a way to kind of break those walls and add, I guess, like some layers of interactivity.
I yeah, I think about that a lot. Like what more can we do with the art mediums that we have? Because I'm totally cool with people pushing virtual reality, and I think virtual reality should be a thing, or like AR. Um, but like having read House of Leaves because I had to,
Yeah.
and then I recently finished reading S, which is another sort of thing like that. I don't know if you're familiar with that book.
No,
Uh,
I read House of Leaves though.
okay, S is not a horror book, but it's written by J.J. Abrams and Doug Dorst,
Oh,
and it like very much makes the medium is the message true for the book. Um it's a book that two characters are writing in the margins of. So you
oh,
um like the book itself comes in a box that's sealed because it has inserts because they've written notes to each other. All the pages are like dyed sort of a blotchy yellow, um, etc., etc. But that the idea that like there is a story and then there's footnotes from the translator and there's all these annotations in the margins because these two characters are writing notes to each other and the ink for those notes are in different colors denotating like different times. um
wow. Yeah, it sounds ambitious.
it certainly was, and I have no idea like how you would even begin to do something like that. Like House of Leaves kind of makes sense where instead of opening up Word you open up InDesign and then you just kind of go and you have a layered narrative, and what you end up with is a book that people have to like spin around in their hands and hold up to a mirror to read.
Yeah, yeah, because some parts of that book were really strong. It just that well, especially just the kind of the core of the book that uh was it like the Davidson record was like
Mm-hmm.
it's yeah. Just there was a lot of I like that idea that well it's very like cosmic horror where the house is bigger on the inside than on the outside. Uh, and just that sense of growing claustrophobia, but he's able to sort of reflect that on the page by making the writing smaller. I thought that was really clever.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it is definitely like it's work to read through that, and it takes yeah, you just need to really set some time aside and dedicate yourself to it.
You have some of that. The house is bigger on the inside, and in your work too. Um,
Oh, with yeah, Feast of You, the house, yeah, with the
yeah.
door leading to different parts of the house that they didn't know existed, and yeah, um, yeah, the whole idea, like I said before, like it's sort of like cosmic horror, but disguised as a domestic drama. And uh, Andrew J. Stone, a friend of mine, he's also a writer. Um, he said he compared it to Dogtooth,
Oh, I love that movie.
and that was a huge compliment, and that was kind of what I was going for. And I don't know if I succeeded entirely with the kind of the low key cosmic elements, because the whole there's a scene where like the house literally moves through space, but it's all told in a dream sequence to sort of like add like a buffer. Uh, but the implication is that it's actually is moving like that. But yeah, it's just yeah, I'm hoping people will read it as a drama as opposed to a cosmic horror story.
I like that. I like that a lot. I find that um, kind of going in a different but similar place. Um, Kind of back to body horror. I've been doing a painfully incrementally more amount of like academic reading on body horror.
Oh yeah.
Um, for a project that I'm working on, and uh, I found an article from the 90s where this woman posits that there's like three different types of extreme um, genre. There's body horror, pornography, and melodrama. And it's so funny to me that in 2019, like, almost 30 years after she wrote this, like, those are the same thing.
Yeah, it's true, and it always struck me as weird, like that body horror. Because for me, I just so much in body horror, like for subtext, and you can explore these really kind of difficult subjects, but tell it through the body and add this extra layer of intimacy. And that's one of the reasons why I find Cronenberg really works and why his work is so intelligent. Of course, like he's showing these like incredibly grotesque images, but uh, the kind of the ideas he's conveying are very kind of like in depth and thought out. And because the guy, yeah, primarily like he's a really intelligent man and he has a very scientific mind, and that really comes through in his films.
For sure. Like Shivers is very sexual. Rabbit is sexual. The Fly has a lot of sex in it.
Yeah.
Dead Ringers is very sexual, like
Yeah.
auto-sexual in
Yeah.
a sort of way, which you don't see a lot of on film.
No, and his stuff for the most part it still holds up because I'm editing or co-editing an anthology of Cronenberg. It's called The New Flesh, stories inspired by or fiction, yeah, like or tribute, sorry, a literary tribute to David Cronenberg. Uh, and I'm editing that with Sam Richard of Weird Punk Press, and so while I'm editing this story, I wanted to kind of revisit a lot of his movies, and I watched Shivers a couple weeks ago, and it's still some of it's still really kind of hard to watch, even though there's moments where that it devolves into comedy, just because like the nature of some of these films like don't age well, but for the most part, yeah, it's still very unsettling. And had this been made now, I don't think it would have happened. Like this wouldn't have taken off in in 2019.
No.
Gotten away with, because it's very like it's the whole film. It's in there's the terror comes from like these familiar people suddenly turn into these like mindless rape zombies, and that's horrifying. And yeah, it's just, and the interesting thing to me too is that I think someone approached Cronenberg and asked him if the AIDS epidemic influenced The Fly, and
Oh,
he
sure.
said, and he said no. But then he also said if his famous comment about if his films are minded, and his response was something like, "I'm Canadian, so I don't really have like intent. Like, there's no like political intent."
Yeah, you guys all just pay 90% taxes in your pseudo-socialist utopia up there.
Oh yeah, I don't know. Like Ontario, we have a new premier now who's not looking too kindly on the province. So I don't know. It
Mm.
seems like, yeah.
One of the things I think works for Shivers, especially now, is the 70s-ness of it. I'm looking at screenshots, and uh, there's, and it might just be me, but like there's the like 70s filmmaking had a look to it that uh like it's unsettling no matter the genre of the film.
Yeah, and I think it's probably the grain and the lighting, and I love the '70s aesthetic personally. If I could find a house that was like basically a time capsule, that all the furnishings and all the decorations were from the '70s, I'd be in heaven. That'd be amazing. Uh,
those weird like pill things that open up into a chair, but you have to sit on it very
yeah,
strangely for it to work.
yeah. There's so many just absurd things where, and yeah, everything like the paneling, and yeah, like you said, like the plastic and everything gleaming, or it's just like kind of a dull brown.
Did you, when you were starting to get into horror, did you like, were you kind of scattershot, grabbing everything that you could, or did you move through subgenres and decades and stuff like that?
Yeah, it was very like I think of it now like almost like following a web. I started. I bought an anthology of monster themed stories because I felt like it was a good way to kind of, it would kind of hold my hand into the horror genre. Because as a kid, I liked monster films. Like I watched like all like the Ray Harryhausen's movies and uh, all the Japanese Godzilla films.
Mm.
So that was I thought that was a good bet. And from there, I bought a book called it was like on writing horror. And it was put out by the Horror Writers Association and edited by Mort Castle, I think. And there's a section toward the beginning, right after the intro, where it's like basically a list of essential reading if you're going to write horror fiction.
Oh.
Um, so you had obviously like the classics, like there was Frankenstein and Dracula, but then there was also Richard Matheson, uh, yeah, and some like some pretty deep cuts too. Like, well, not Joe Lansdale's not a deep cut, but some. But yeah, I just kind of started there, and then you would read one thing, and then you do an internet search a bit like what's similar to this, and then you just follow that web, and so like you go from like, for example, reading Lovecraft to finding Thomas Ligotti and like Ramsey Campbell,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and eventually like the one writer that really struck a nerve with me was Clive Barker. Because I think I might be wrong, but I think his Books of Blood was in that list in the book on writing horror, and that it's immensely humbling. Like Nightmares and Ecstasies being compared to those books. Um, yeah, because those were really formative for me, just in terms of I like his marriage of this almost like near purple prose with like this really grotesque imagery, and he's just uh, very forward thinking with his ideas. And yeah, just a huge fan of his work.
I'm so sad that my experience with Clive Barker is kind of backward. Um,
Oh yes, you started with his fantasy, or
yeah, I was gifted Imagica and then Weave World, and I haven't made it to his horror stuff. I have many things to read. I can't just like dig through one author at a time. But
yeah,
I mean, I've seen the Hellraiser movies and uh, what's that, Nightbreed and
yeah,
those things. So like I get the aesthetic, but I wish I had experienced the horror writing first, because I get what you're saying about like the purple prose too, because I was reading all of his urban fantasy stuff, which really lends itself to that sort of thing.
hmm yeah. And actually, it was funny. Like our experiences are totally reversed because I read his. I think it helped too. So like when I first read, like the first time I ever picked up Clive Barker. So I was talking earlier that I had a central nervous system lupus, and I was on corticosteroids for a while, like too long, and it ended up wearing down my hips. So I needed a double hip replacement, and I think it was the first because it was a year apart because I needed a weight bearing leg between surgeries, and it was the first surgery, and I was lying in the hospital bed, and I remember my dad ran and got me The Brood, like the Cronenberg film, and Clive Barker's Books of Blood because I asked for these things and like I wanted to pass the time. And I was high on morphine and I read The Midnight Meat Train in the hospital, and that was a really bad idea. But I think that it just because of that, it just sort of like Clive Barker was just kind of like branded onto my brain. But yeah, because of that, because I started with horror, I was very reluctant reading his fantasy. And I only recently like this past winter read Weave World, which I guess is kind of widely considered his best fantasy work. Yeah, and it's great. It's just it's so different, at least to me, compared to something like well, any of the Books of Blood stories or Damnation Game or The Hellbound Heart.
Yeah, I also find that my descent into horror is much more visual than yours too. I don't read a lot of like horror type stuff. Everyone maybe once or twice a year I try to read one of the older things. I have like an Algernon Blackwood book
Oh yeah.
and we mentioned Legati, who's not older. But like my horror journey started mostly watching 80s B movies.
Oh
So
yeah.
The Stuff and Chud
Yeah.
and things like that, Reanimator and the Hellraiser movies and the Nightmare on Elm Street movies and
Yeah, I'm kind of bummed out that I didn't have that in my childhood because like I said like I wasn't into horror and growing up like the early 2000s and the late 90s I feel like were like the worst time like the worst times for horror film.
oh god, yes.
Uh yeah, like just like these really bad like kind of ultra polished movies that like I think like that's sort of one of the reasons why I didn't take it seriously for so long because like I don't know, I wasn't like I didn't like the Saw films or something like Wrong Turn, like all those, and I didn't
Hmm.
even like. I mean, I'm probably in the kind of minority, but I don't like the Scream films either.
Oh yeah.
uh I just feel like the meta thing is a little condescending. Maybe now because
Mm.
it was at the time, but yeah, it's just it was unfortunate that I didn't get to like Chud and the stuff and like all those really good kind of 80s schlock films and like when I started kind of self-educating on the genre. Um, but I watched everything and it was like even like the most bottom of the barrel. I remember watching this movie called The Corpse Grinders and
Oh, that
it
sounds
made
familiar.
yeah, and it was the copy that I had was so grainy that I could barely tell what was happening, but it was basically I think someone puts like taints cat food, and then when the cats start eating it, they develop a taste for human flesh. And so it's half the movie, like just from my experience watching it, because it was so dark, it was just it was cats yowling and people screaming in like a half lit room. So I would watch that, and then I'd watch like movies like have you seen Possession with Sam Neill?
Probably, but I don't remember right now.
I think it's French, or it was multiple countries involved in its production, but it's primarily French, I think. And it's just like it's a story about infidelity, but it's probably one of the weirdest stories, weirdest approaches to that topic.
I don't. Maybe I haven't seen this. I'm looking at the screenshots. Man, he's doing his Sam Neill thing though.
Mhm. Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, I my like movie horror education basically started when I got Netflix because you watch one thing and then Netflix thinks that it's your favorite thing in the world
Oh yeah.
um and I'm not a huge like physical media guy when it comes to film. I don't read ebooks or anything, but I tend to prefer to stream my movies and not have them cluttering my house. But so like deeper cut type movies, like a lot of this sort of dark, grainy um, Japanese horror films I haven't seen unless it was like a friend saying, "Hey, I got a copy of Tokyo Gore Police. We gotta
Yeah.
watch Tokyo Gore Police," which was really uncomfortable for me with the self harming thing at that point in my life. But
Oh,
like,
yeah, I could see that. Yeah.
um, so like, there's a lot that I haven't seen that I need to see, but I don't know if I just need to like start buying Blu-rays and DVDs, or if I need to start going into the seedier parts of the internet again to be able to watch stuff streaming with Russian subtitles, or what.
Yeah, that's the thing, because like with me, like I love the idea, like streaming, like being able to just go like on the PlayStation Store and rent a film and watch it instantly. Like I am nostalgic, obviously, for like going to a Blockbuster, but like that's the problem too, is like because of digital distribution, a lot of these deeper cut films tend not to get any distribution, so they just kind of get lost in the kind of the media void. So I think like I do like owning physical copies, but I'm very selective. Like I too have that issue with space, and I just tend to get stuff that like my whole mentality is like something really weird where you wouldn't be able to just readily have access to, and just knowing that like I own this like this this film I really like, or that it's just harder to get. I think that's the appeal for me. It's almost like a personal archive.
Sure, yeah, you have an artifact of something that is important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've found that with like owning movies, it generally needs to at least come with a director commentary or something to give me value in the rewatch. So I don't rewatch a lot of movies aside from Eraserhead because I am that basic.
It's a good movie though. I still like that one. I think that's my favorite. I don't know. It's a tie between that and Blue Velvet for me
Mm.
for a favorite Lynch film. But yeah, I do love Eraserhead.
The first time I ever encountered Eraserhead, and I just remembered this through telling a story to some work friends. I was at a friend's house, and I think we had been drinking, and we decided to watch Primer, but we had decided like very late, 1 or 2 in the morning, and I fell asleep halfway through Primer and woke up halfway through Eraserhead.
Oh, that's perfect.
And my mind broke.
You're probably thinking your nightmare was being streamed onto the television.
It was very, very weird, and that guy who I was watching with, like, he definitely needed somebody awake experiencing Eraserhead with him, because you can't even start humming in heaven, everything is fine, without him becoming very uncomfortable.
You see, like I actually never had the privilege of watching Eraserhead with someone. It was always like, I remember though, back when I was single, like it was kind of this thing that I wanted to try and be like, hey, you want to come over to my house and watch Eraserhead? But it was just like the least, romantic, or just like it's like good luck, impress someone. Well, it would be pretty cool if the person was like really into it, but it was just this thing for me where, like, I think I was 16 years old when I saw it for the first time, and I deliberately sought it out. It was really backwards. It was so I got into bizarro fiction, or I discovered bizarro fiction. Then I remember one day I typed in bizarro in Google or something, or Eraserhead, because the main press for bizarro is Eraserhead Press, and the film came up, and I'm like, oh, this looks cool, so I watched that, and that just kind of is this weird way of discovering that movie. Not as weird, not as good as yours though. That's pretty good.
Yeah, I had heard about it before because I had a friend who had found like just the gold mine torrent of horror films back in high school, and she's like, so I just downloaded 200 horror movies and I'm gonna watch them all. I'm like, all right, dude, good luck. But she would tell me about them. So instead of learning chemistry, I heard about a lot of strange horror films.
Oh, okay.
So I have found too that it seems like body horror tends to translate to film at least more. And
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe you know better than I do. Was body horror a film thing first, or was it a literature thing first?
That's definitely something I gave thought to, because a few people that read the collection were saying like, oh, I never knew that there was body horror fiction before, and obviously like there is horror novels and short stories with body horror elements, but I do feel like it's primarily like it works better in a visual medium, because I remember picking up, how like forget the name of the press, but they put out like the Mammoth Book of, and like just fill in the blank, like the Mammoth Book of Vampires, or like the
Sure.
one and they released one called the Mammoth Book of Body Horror. and they tried to go chronologically from the story that Mary Shelley wrote, and the name's escaping. I think not the Body Snatcher, something along those lines. But I felt like a lot of the earlier stuff they were selecting was a bit of a stretch. But I do like I would say that yeah, I think it has its roots firmly in film, and I think just now it's sort of really taking off in literature. Because you know I feel like with literature you can actually add that extra element in terms of like you can explore what's going through the character's mind as like his or her body's transforming, you know, and that's not something you can necessarily get on film. You can just get the purely visceral side of it.
Yeah, absolutely. You can start making things a lot dreamier, a lot quicker
Yeah.
with
Oh,
language and choosing certain words, rather than relying on lighting or practical effects or something like that. I definitely
yeah.
think that that's a thing, for lack of better words.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, and there's like the whole splatterpunk thing too, which I'm not super um, hip to, but it certainly seems like between splatterpunk and bizarro, there is a place for body horror these days and horror lit.
Yeah, and I feel like it, we're in like really interesting times because like horror is having like quite the resurgence right now. There's a lot of publishers that are opening new horror labels to accommodate this influx of horror fiction, which is amazing. And just like looking at Netflix, so like the sheer number of exclusives that they're releasing that are, you know, basically horror movies or horror series, and I just love it because, you know, like I just feel like we're what we're moving towards now is sort of like, you know, if you thought of like the early like 90s thinking about superhero films and like they're few and far between, and now it's such like this staple in popular culture. And I feel like horror has always been like obviously a little more like at the forefront, but I feel like right now it's exploding to like this like such a magnitude that yeah, it's interesting to see. And like there's because of that, there's a lot more weirder um, films coming out, and people are taking risks, which is always good.
Yeah, and you have places like Blumhouse that are allowing that to happen too. Their stated uh, producer roles are basically let the writers and directors do their thing and do their best to accommodate what their vision is. So
Yeah, and it runs counter to the major studios, and it's amazing. Yeah, and it's mostly because I think Blumhouse has this low budget policy, but it like I mean, it basically I love that because having a lower budget forces you to be creative. So you end up with more ingenuity in your film than something with like a $300 million budget where the ceiling's so high that you can't possibly reach it.
yeah, you have James Cameron doing a horror film for in the style of Avatar. Just 3D, high frame rate. Everybody has to sit in the D-box seats that shake you around. We're projecting smells through the scenes like you're at a Disney place.
Yeah, you need to bring back Smelloscope. That's one thing that we're missing.
Oh,
That
absolutely.
was just imagine watching a John Waters film with Smelloscope.
Oh, no thank you. Ugh. Oh man. Yeah. Oh man, Johnny Depp really smells as bad as he looks like he smells. Oh god.
Every McConaughey movie is just like just the whole theater smells like body odor.
Body odor and Axe body spray.
Yeah.
We are nearing the end of the non-reading literature portion. Do you have uh I'm going to give you the final word.
Okay. Um, okay, so I have a creative essay coming out this month through the Town Crier. It's kind of a part of a journal called The Puritan. It's out of Canada, and it's about my experiences with horror and living with central nervous system lupus. So check that out. I also I'm co-editing David Cronenberg anthology, The New Flesh, and that should be out soon-ish. We're in the editing phases right now. I have a short story coming out in August, I believe, in a collection called Pluto and Furs. And the story's called Walking in Ash, and it's a sort of a story about anxiety and the end of the world. And I'll have my follow-up with Clash will be coming out near the end of the year, so keep an eye out for that. All right, so this I'm going to read from the last story in Nightmares in Ecstasy. It's a novelette called The Feast of You, and I'll read basically the first chapter as just as kind of a teaser. Riker looked at the sky reflected in his coffee. Thick iron clouds pushed in from the city he had just fled, moving toward the diner with almost predatory purpose. He shifted uneasily in his booth. Cracked and blistered vinyl creaked under his weight. He brought the mug to his lips and drank. His hand shook so badly a thread of coffee dribbled from the corner of his mouth. It was scalding, but he barely noticed. The only thought that occupied his mind was how he needed to get as far away from the city as possible. And as soon as the caffeine kicked in, he couldn't afford to waste another minute. He was, after all, still within their zone of influence. Despite its stinging warmth, the coffee, straight black and electrified with 3 packs of sugar, did an excellent job jump-starting his system. He hadn't slept in over 48 hours, and the energy now easing into his bloodstream almost brought tears to his eyes. The only thing was, he also had very little to drink in the last couple days, and the coffee was beginning to fill his bladder to the point of discomfort. An itinerary formed in his mind. He'd take a piss, finish his 3rd cup, leave the diner, drive until nightfall, find a cheap motel, unplug the room's electronics to prevent them from learning of his whereabouts, get a good night's sleep, and finish up the drive in the morning. There was bound to be some place where they couldn't find him. He hoped with every quivering nerve in his body that it wasn't simply a pipe dream. The bell above the door jangled. Riker spun around so fast his neck cracked. A family of 3 stood in the entrance. They looked like they'd stepped from the pages of a department store catalog. The father had a kind but plain face, balding, the dark hair on his temples turning gray. He wore a t-shirt with the logo of some sports team Riker remembered from his childhood. His wife was a head shorter, also plain but beautiful in her way. A scarf was knotted loosely around her neck and a purse dangled from one arm. She held her daughter's hand, the diamond of her ring finger catching and refracting the diner's fluorescent light. The child was clad in bright colors, and in her other hand she carried a plastic zip container decorated with leering cartoon characters. Sweat popped on Riker's forehead and trickled down the groove of his spine. An invisible fist punched through his stomach and squeezed his entrails. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't move. He watched, riveted with terror, as the father inclined his head, said something to his daughter that made her laugh, and together the family made their way to a booth on the opposite side of the diner. The only other patron apart from Riker, an older man with a gray beard and weather-worn jacket, smiled at the little girl as she passed. Riker tore his eyes away from the new arrivals. The clouds reflected in his coffee were closer now. He scooted to the edge of his seat, shot up, and walked briskly to the bathroom. His bladder was so full it hurt, and for one embarrassed second he thought he'd pissed himself, but it was only sweat. It coated every inch of his body like an amniotic sac. The bathroom door hit the wall with a thunderclap smash. He darted toward the urinal, fumbled with his fly, and let loose a stream so powerful it splashed back from the stained porcelain. He bowed his head, breath coming out in labored gasps. His heart hammered, gunfire quick. Empty, he zipped up, staggered to the sink. His long black hair was plastered to his forehead. He threw cold water on his face, made a sound cross between a groan and a whimper. That family, they're just people, they're harmless. Even so, they reminded Riker too much of them, those things he'd fled from. He remained at the sink for another minute or two, hands grasping the edges, head bent toward the drain. When his heart rate slowed and his breathing grew steady, he straightened and exited the bathroom. The family, the old man and the waitress behind the counter all stared at him. His throat moved. He directed his gaze at the floor. Quick, purposeful strides carried him to his booth. He gripped the handle of his coffee mug in a quaking fist and downed the rest of its contents, wincing at a bitter taste he hadn't noticed before. When he turned around, running a hand over his mouth, the waitress was standing inches from his face. "Ready to settle up?" she asked. Yeah, he managed to stutter, removing the wallet from his back pocket. He threw a 5 on the chip formica and got the hell out of there. He had to move. The engine of his rusted beater growled in protest before sputtering to life. He peeled out of the gravel parking lot, throwing up dust and hitting the highway at 60 miles an hour. The woods on either side blurred into abstraction, flashes of green, brown, and gray as the sky leaked through gaps between the trees. When the diner shrank, then disappeared in the rearview mirror, Riker finally eased off the gas. The speedometer swung from 120 to 90. Thankfully, this piece of shit didn't explode. And he couldn't help but laugh. It was strained but genuine, and the longer it went on, the louder and more unhinged it became. Soon he was howling, tears blurring his vision, an open palm beating a crazed rhythm against the ceiling. Calm returned in waves until he was silent and staring at the road, his throat and chest sore from the outburst. Silence reigned for a time before he decided to turn on the radio. It should be safe to listen to a couple of songs, he reasoned. As long as he remained quiet, they wouldn't be able to hear him over the airwaves. The jockey said, "Now here's a favorite of mine. I think many of you out there can use some of its medicine, especially with all the bad in the world lately. So here's..." Riker relaxed his shoulders, easing back into his seat, allowing the music to wash over him. The drum beat a slow, heavy sound. The guitar was mellow and muted, the lyrics deep-voiced and lullaby smooth. Combined with the monotony of the road, the flashing yellow lines, Riker felt himself lulled into a trance-like state. His eyelids grew heavy, his muscles slack. A flash in the rearview mirror. He shook his head to clear it. Another flash, and Riker recognized it for what it was. Lightning. The clouds and the storm they carried were closing in. His head was full of cotton. His eyelids dropped, and his limbs were growing numb. What the hell is happening? He blinked several times, but his vision refused to clear. It was like his eyes were smeared with petroleum jelly. He pulled onto the side of the road and could only tell he was on the shoulder by the crunch of gravel under the tires. His eyes were useless, and he could barely keep them open. His breathing grew shallower by the second, the rise and fall of his chest a lulling rhythm. Oh shit. No, I can't fall asleep now. What's going on? He lifted a leaden arm and clumsily jabbed the button to turn off the radio. Silence except for his own breathing. Thunder rumbled not far behind. His eyelids fluttered closed, his head lolled onto one shoulder. Please, don't fall asleep. The plea crawled around inside his head. As he plunged into a mire of unconsciousness, his last thought was of the strange bitterness in his last mouthful of coffee.